What kind of father forgets the birth date of his own child? It's a brutal question, cold, unforgiving, the kind that cuts past the courtesies and gestures and goes straight to something primal. But on that particular day in London, in a courtroom where truth wasn't optional, it was sworn, this question didn't come from a critic, or a commentator, or a paparazzo, it came from a judge. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. A judge, presiding over the highest court in the United Kingdom, during the final stage of one of the most public and expensive privacy trials in royal history, turned to the Duke of Sussex and asked, calmly, plainly, what should have been a simple question. When exactly were your children born, Your Royal Highness? What followed wasn't a firm answer, not even a quick correction. There was a pause. A long one. The kind of pause that eats up oxygen. That makes the room smaller, tighter, sharper. Prince Harry, seated before the court, flanked by his legal team and surrounded by the silent watchfulness of journalists, recorders, and aides, didn't speak right away. He blinked. He looked down, and then he guessed. Now, that might not sound like much to someone who hasn't followed every twist and turn of this particular royal chapter, but if you've been paying attention, and if you've been watching Harry's war with the press unfold over the years, you know why this moment matters. Because Harry's entire case, his entire presence in that courtroom, hinges on a very specific claim: that the press has violated his family's privacy to such an extreme degree they've compromised the most sacred part of his life, his children. The very names are more than names. They're symbols of legacy, escape, reinvention, of a father's attempt to create something safe, something untouched by the winds of monarchy and the cruelty of headlines. So when Harry stumbled over their birth dates, in a trial explicitly about privacy and intrusion, it wasn't just a misstep. It was a rupture, a tear in the tightly controlled narrative he and Meghan have spent years building. And in that courtroom, for a few seconds that stretched like hours, even the judge's posture seemed to shift, as if the ground beneath the story had moved. Now, let's be very clear. This isn't a takedown. This isn't some tabloid gleefully tearing into the Duke's every misworded phrase. We're not here for that. This is something else. This is a reckoning. Because what happened that day in court wasn't just a celebrity gaffe or a slip of memory. It opened up a whole set of questions that many people, inside and outside the palace, have been quietly asking for years. Questions about timelines, records, appearances, contradictions. Questions about the difference between a public figure's right to privacy and the public's right to the truth. And, perhaps most uncomfortable of all, questions about the children themselves. Not in the cruel way, not in the ugly, conspiratorial way the internet sometimes plays with, but in a deeply human, deeply unnerving way. How do you protect a truth you might not fully know? Because here's the thing most people don't talk about. Memory is fragile, especially under pressure. Especially when the stakes are high, when you've crafted a narrative for the world, and suddenly you're being asked to recount it, not to a friendly interviewer or a sympathetic biographer, but to a judge, under oath, on record. Have you ever blanked on a detail in front of someone you desperately needed to impress? Ever fumbled a date, a number, an event, even something deeply personal, because your nerves were louder than your thoughts? Now, imagine doing that? While the world is watching, that's where Harry was. But still, this wasn't just any detail. It was the birth date of his child, and when he fumbled it, the courtroom changed. Not dramatically. There was no audible gasp, no banging gavel. But there was a shift. You could feel it. Something that had been tightly choreographed suddenly felt vulnerable. That's when the story stopped being about the tabloids and started being about the man himself. Because this wasn't just about privacy anymore, it was about truth. And whether Prince Harry, after years of lawsuits, interviews, memoirs, and Netflix documentaries, could still tell it cleanly, simply, without contradiction, or whether the machinery around him, the media, the strategists, the ghostwriters, the PR teams, had done something else, something subtler, something more dangerous. Maybe they'd built a reality so carefully curated, even Harry couldn't keep track of it anymore, and now, under oath, that reality was cracking. Let's take a breath here. This is a lot to take in. A prince on the stand, stumbling over something so personal, so intimate, that it ripples outward like a stone in a pond. But let's step back. Let's ask what brought us here. Because this wasn't an isolated moment. It wasn't some random line in a dull court hearing. This was the culmination of years of battles, legal battles, public battles, internal ones. Harry's war with the press didn't begin yesterday. It began the day he was born into the most public family on earth. It was sharpened by the death of his mother, Princess Diana, chased through the streets by cameras. It was crystallized in that fateful moment he and Meghan walked away from the firm, clutching their newborn son and declaring their right to privacy. But privacy, it turns out, has a cost. And now, years later, that cost has brought him back, alone, to the very institution he once tried to escape, the British courts. But here's the strange part. For all his claims about privacy, Harry brought this trial himself. He initiated it. He demanded it. He wanted this fight. And when you do that, you invite scrutiny. You invite questions. You invite the moment when someone, perhaps a judge, asks you to prove your narrative, not through storytelling or sympathy, but through facts, dates, times. And if you hesitate, if you can't provide them, even for a second, the whole thing wobbles. Which brings us back to that moment, the question, the pause, the guessing. Was it nerves? Was it an honest mistake? Or was it something more structural? A sign that the story doesn't hold as tightly as we thought. Now, before you jump to conclusions, before you say this is proof of one thing or another, let's walk this carefully. Let's look at what came before, what led up to this courtroom exchange, what Harry has said and not said about his children, what the records show, what the timelines suggest, what the palace knew, what the press guessed, what the world believed. And then, only then, let's look at what happened after. Because trust me, that moment wasn't the peak of the drama, it was just the spark. Because what came next, after Harry fumbled that answer, set off a chain of events that would ripple far beyond that courtroom. Across oceans, across media empires, across royal boundaries. It would raise suspicions in places no one expected. It would drag up documents no one thought would ever see the light of day, and it would force Harry, again and again, to confront a question he'd spent years trying to avoid. What's real and what's narrative? Nally. You see, when you spend years building a fortress of privacy, the last place you want to be is under oath. But that's where Harry found himself. And as we'll see, it wasn't just the judge who was asking hard questions. Family, advisors, even former friends. They were all watching, waiting, wondering. Because if you can't remember your child's birthday in court, what else might you forget? That's where this story begins. And what happens next? Well, that part changes everything. So, what does it look like when a man walks back into the storm he once ran from? Not dramatically, not with camera flashes or crowds shouting outside a palace gate. That's the cliché version. The one people expect when a royal returns home after years in exile. If you can even call it that. No, Prince Harry arrived in London with little fanfare, No Meghan, no children, no entourage, apart from his legal team and a silent, watchful security detail. Just a coat collar raised against the English wind and a look on his face that didn't quite match the usual PR-polished confidence. It was something else, something quieter, a kind of tension that doesn't show up on the front page but settles in the space between footsteps. Because here's what most people don't understand about this moment. It wasn't just another court appearance. It wasn't just Harry showing up to sit through another session in his legal battle against Britain's tabloid press and documented gender of espionage. This was the trial, the third, the final, the most consequential. And he chose to come back for it. Now think about that. He didn't have to be there. His lawyers could have argued on his behalf. He could have stayed in Montecito, shielded by the Californian sun and the fortress of controlled interviews. But instead, he flew in, alone. There's something in that decision that feels revealing, maybe even desperate, or strategic. Maybe both. Because Harry didn't just want to win this case, he needed to be seen fighting it. He needed to be seen, which is ironic, isn't it? Considering everything he said about privacy, about not wanting the cameras, the scrutiny, the exposure, and yet here he was, deliberately stepping into a courtroom, knowing full well that every glance, every frown, every pause would be dissected, frame by frame, by the very press he claimed had destroyed his peace. Why? What was he hoping to prove? Was this about principal legacy, revenge? Or was there something else beneath it? Some unspoken pressure, some private truth pressing at the seams of his public story. We don't know. Not yet. But what we do know is that the moment he walked into that courtroom, everything changed. Because this wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a performance, and not the kind scripted in a Netflix deal. This one was real. No edits. No protective lighting. Just a man in front of a judge, with the past chasing at his heels. Let's talk about the setting for a second. The Royal Courts of Justice isn't exactly a warm place. Architecturally stunning, yes. But emotionally? It's cold. Deliberate. Built for clarity, not comfort. The kind of place that doesn't flinch at scandal because it's designed to look through it. And when Harry entered those doors, flanked by his legal counsel, he wasn't Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, beloved son of Diana, media martyr or Netflix darling. He was the claimant, just another man asking for justice in a room that doesn't care how many crowns sit in your family tree. And in that space, something became apparent almost immediately. He wasn't entirely in control. You could see it in the way he sat. Not slouched, but not regal either. The way he adjusted his coat. Not out of cold, but nerves. The way he avoided eye contact with the press gallery, even as cameras tried to catch a glimpse of whatever emotion they could sell on tomorrow's front page. There was no sign of Meghan, no whispers of the children being nearby. No indication that he was there as part of a larger family unit. It was just Harry, and that's when it started to feel different. Because if you strip away the titles, the drama, the headlines, what you're left with is a man standing in front of a system he once believed had failed him, now asking it to believe him. It's a strange circle, isn't it? Years spent denouncing the British establishment, only to come back and place your trust in its courts. But that's the contradiction at the heart of this story. Harry wants justice, but on his terms. He wants to be believed, but only within the frame he's drawn. He wants privacy, but not silence. And here, in this moment, all of those threads were tightening. You could feel it in the way the barristers adjusted their papers, in the way the judge glanced briefly before speaking, in the way even the stenographer paused before typing the opening statements. This wasn't just another trial. It was the beginning of an unraveling. And the courtroom, stone cold and echoing, was the perfect stage. But here's something even more important. Before a single question was asked, before the infamous birth date pause that would go viral within hours, there was already tension. Not courtroom tension, human tension. Because everyone in that room knew what was at stake. Not just the money, not even the reputation, but the story. The story of Prince Harry.
Who, yes.
What he stands for. And whether that image, carefully cultivated over years of appearances, interviews, memoirs, and polished documentaries, could survive legal cross-examination. Because courtrooms don't care about optics. They care about consistency. And that's where things get tricky. Because Harry's story? How? It's not always been consistent. One date here, another there. One timeline in a podcast, another in a legal document. Emotional accounts that stir sympathy but don't always add up. And when that kind of story is dragged into a courtroom, under oath, with no script and no edits, things happen, truths emerge. Or cracks show, sometimes both. So as the judge prepared to begin and the lawyers took their seats,